What's up guys, Eugene here. Today we are back with a special video. This time I'm going to be bringing y'all the jungle guide for tips to help climb through ranks that y'all have been requesting lately. And in some of my past videos I mentioned that if y'all wanted it, I could totally make one for y'all. So here we are. Now if you enjoy this video and want more guides for other topics, since a lot of things that I am going to talk about in this video, they're really super in-depth concepts that you could easily make them each into their own video. Some examples being like lane management, jungle pathing, invading, enemy jungle tracking, and etc. Just make sure to leave a like on this video and subscribe, since this video did take quite a decent amount of time and effort to make. And also comment down below what kind of guides and topics you want me to cover in the future. And if y'all support this video, I can for sure roll out some more. But this video is going to be split up a bit, and that's because my viewership ranges along a lot of tiers, going all the way from silver up to grandmasters. And in this video I want to mention some tips that are going to be useful for all tiers. So what this means is I'm going to put these tips into two sections: lower tier tips and higher tier tips. Of course, this doesn't mean that if you're a higher tier player, you should skip straight ahead to the higher tier tips, although you can if you want, because a lot of higher tier players, they do lack fundamentals that are vital to the game that are really lower tier concepts, but they just don't have them either. But you might have already heard some of them, so I just wanted to make that clear. And if you're a lower tier player, you should still watch the higher tier section, as most of the tips I'm going to be given in the lower tier section are relatively basic tips, and then the higher tier section will have the bulk of the tips that are going to be complex and important to understand once you do get high in the ranks, but they could still be useful for y'all. So some background for me, by the way, if you haven't seen any of my videos before or a brand new viewer, I'm a Grandmaster Jungler. I started playing about 3 months ago. I never played League on PC or anything, so I'm learning everything slowly from scratch. And this season, I want to try and push for Challenger. Sadly, I ran out of time last season, just because the season reset hit. But I think this season, I can definitely get there. On my channel, I have a lot of gameplay, and that shows a lot of these tips that I'm going to be talking about in actual matches. So if you want to see them in action, make sure to check them out if you want. And I'll also leave a link to my Discord server in the description. If you want to just join to just chill, ask any questions, find people to play with, that's a good place to be. But anyways, that's enough talking. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as it always supports the channel and it is free. And let's get right into the video. Okay, so to start things off, we're going to be covering the basic tips for lower tiers. And one of the first things I'm going to say right off the bat is that not all games are winnable. This applies for all tiers, not just the lower tiers, but especially in lower tiers. Some of your teammates will feed like crazy. That's just how it's just going to happen. I'm sure some of y'all have experienced this. All of y'all, I'm sure. And especially if they feed a late game champ, somebody like Vayne, almost nothing can be done in some matches. But overall, you should be able to climb out and win a decent amount of your games. And the first tip I want to give y'all is finding champs that fit your playstyle. The jungle champs, in my opinion, they can generally be split up into two groups: assassins and then bruisers-tanks. Assassins, of course, they're going to be champs like Evelynn, Lee Sin, Khazix, and these champs are going to excel in 1v1s versus squishies. They're going to become super scary when they get fed, but the downside to them is that they are a bit harder to play due to their squishiness, and they struggle in teamfights. On the other hand, you have the bruisers-tanks, some examples being Wukong, Vi, Rammus, and these are a bit easier to play. They're relatively simple, and they have more impact in teamfights due to their tankiness that they provide, but they don't have the same hard carry potential that assassins have when they do get fed. Now that doesn't mean that you can't hard carry on bruisers or tanks, it just means that assassins are just super hard to deal with when they get ahead, so those champs are just ridiculous to deal with once they get ahead, just because they can one burst anybody. Now I recommend finding 3 to 4 champs which playstyle you like, and just trying out different champs that you think you might enjoy. And just by mastering a champ, you can easily climb out of lower tiers by learning the abilities, combos, flash combos, power spikes, weaknesses, and then the strengths of your champ and what you need to play for is really important. And just by mastering that, you can definitely climb out. And I think a big issue that a lot of lower tier junglers make is that they don't play to their strengths as their jungler. So for example, if you're going to be playing somebody like Lee Sin, Khazix, your strength is not teamfighting. Forcing teamfights will probably end up making you lose some matches and making it so much harder for you, because those champs are not big teamfight champs. They're looking for 1v1s, small picks in the jungle. But if you are going to find a jungler to main, I definitely recommend looking for champs that have a good jungle clear, because this will allow you to farm up faster and to gank more and get more kills, instead of champs that have a worse clear and that rely more on teams, since you can't really rely on that in lower tiers. Examples being like Rammus, along those lines, Mundo. And a good tip on how to learn the mechanics of a new champ is to watch gameplay for it. For example, on YouTube or Twitch. But I think a big mistake that a lot of players make when they watch YouTube to improve is that they only watch the gameplay and they don't actively try to learn from it. So for example, instead of just watching, you need to put yourself in the person's shoes and be looking at their abilities and thinking to yourself what to use when, what to do for your next rotations, and that'll help you learn more and build more muscle memory instead of just casually watching and be like, that's kind of cool. Now, a big issue that a lot of newer players have is ganking. They go for bad ganks, they really try to force ones that don't get them anything and it wastes their time, and sometimes it even ends up getting them killed, and you need to be patient. You should never lose more members when you're going for a gank than you kill, just because that defeats the purpose of a gank, right? The purpose of a gank is to get a kill, get some gold for you, get your laner ahead too, but if you go for a gank, you die doing it, you're kind of screwing over your team and you're not doing your job as a jungler. Now, the top things to consider when going for a gank. Enemy abilities, do they have anything to escape? Summoner spells, do they have flash, barrier? Minion wave positioning, this is a big thing that I mentioned in my videos a lot. But minion wave positioning will tell you exactly where the champs in the lane will be positioned. Since people will always step up to last hit, so for example, if a wave is being held close to your turret, then there's a good chance that the enemy's going to step far to farm it just because it's all the way at your turret to try and last hit and get gold, making it a good gank. And this is kind of hard to just talk about, so seeing it in action in my videos will definitely help out. But another example, let's just take Ezreal for an example. When deciding to gank an Ezreal, you have to keep in mind what they have, what abilities they have. One of their abilities is a blink. It's a giant blink pretty much. So they have that, plus they have a flash. So ganking that, it's going to be a hard gank, and they can easily escape compared to ganking a champ like Malphite or Darius. These don't have good escapes. They don't have huge mobility skills. Another example, Fizz. If you go for the gank on Fizz, they're going to have their leap ability that's going to dodge everything, right? So considering the lanes and what the enemy has to escape when going for a gank, that can provide really good information on which lanes are actually gankable and which ones you should go for. And sometimes if you're patient enough, you can actually wait to see if they use these key movement abilities before you come out for a gank. So for example, if you're ganking a Camille, you can try and see if they use their hook shot to trade before you pop out. That way they don't have an escape, or else if you just go for the gank right away, then they're just going to hook shot away. And these are things that you need to be noticing on the map when you are farming up your jungle. The champ health, for example, melee versus melee matchups. There's often a lot of trading in those, and that results in low health bars. Be scanning the lanes for any summoner spells that are going to be used. And when you see a good gank, then go for it, instead of trying to force something which you don't need to, or else just go back to farming. Now, in lower tiers, you are going to have to play for yourself and for your strengths, and looking to get yourself fed. And a lot of times, your teammate will engage in bad fights where you're not ready, and there's nothing that can be done about it, really, and they're just going to go for it. But in these cases, a mistake a lot of newer players might make is following up instead of just leaving it. An example is ult-depending champs that really rely on their ult for most of their impact. Some examples being Fizz or Wukong. If your ult is on cooldown for those champs, it's better to be patient and stay alive and keep on farming. That way, once you do get those ults back up, you can be looking for an extra kill or two, and then you can just build up kills over and over, and eventually get yourself fed. And something else I wanted to mention is a lot of people, they just die a lot in the lower tiers, and people don't realize this, but when you're dead, you can't farm and you won't be gaining gold. So even if you think your death means nothing, it's really taken away from you because then you don't have that time to get more gold yourself. Now, the next topic I want to talk about is objectives. Objectives really are key to winning the game, especially in lower tiers. They're often neglected. And as a jungler, you have the influence to start up and take these objectives. When that first dragon and herald spawns at 4 minutes, it's key to make sure you're in position for whichever one you want to go for and be looking for it, and making sure that the enemy jungle does not try and sneak a fast one. Because at the moment, actually, it seems like dragon is the one that's mostly favored. So what that means is by 4 minutes, when that dragon spawns, you need to already have reset, shopped, and be on the side of the map with the dragon so that you can set up good wards and get good positioning. A big mistake that a lot of lower tier players, junglers make is that they go on the opposite side of the map of the drag. And the reason why that's bad is if you're ganking a lane that's on the opposite side of the dragon, the enemy jungler can quickly see that and then start up the drag. And if you realize that, well, you're all the way on the other side of the map. What are you going to do then? And that's a big mistake because you're giving up these drags, which are big buffs. Especially if you're playing an early game champ like Zhao or Lee Sin, getting these buffs early, they'll help carry you through the late game when you start to fall off. And as a jungler, it is your job to secure the drag with the Smite. And a lot of new players, they might forget to Smite or be slow with it. So what I did when I first started, I made the Smite button as big as I could possibly make it because I came from Vainglory, so we didn't have Smite or anything. So it was something that I needed time to get used to and that I kind of forgot a lot. So I made that button as big as I can, so it's literally impossible to miss. And another good habit I recommend making is looking at how much damage your Smite does before starting any big objective. Since knowing exactly what that number is, it can give you an advantage when Smite battles occur, since you're going to exactly know when to Smite, instead of having to look down and having that delay. And another tip for Smite battles is to combine your Smite with other high burst abilities that your champ might have. So for example, Khazix. His first ability can do like almost 400 damage to the first drag when it spawns, plus his Smite does 600 damage. Now what does this mean? This means once that dragon reaches 1000 HP, you can easily first ability plus Smite at the same time and you will get the secure. But that's going to be it for the basic lower tier tips. As I was saying, they were just really basic that I just want to get across for brand new players. And now we're going to get into the more advanced higher tier tips. And don't forget, if y'all are enjoying this and learning a lot and want to see more, make sure to subscribe for more guides. And now we're going to get onto the meat of the video. And there's going to be a lot here because jungling is a very complicated role. But the first thing I want to continue on is the topic of objectives. And this is super relevant once you get above Emerald tier because everybody wants to fight for every drag. And that is a huge mistake. Don't get me wrong, of course. Drags are important and they're nice. But that doesn't mean you have to contest everyone, especially the first one. Now, let me explain why, and people don't realize this at all, almost nobody realizes this, but dragons are percentage buffs, meaning that based on the stats you have, they amplify them by a certain percentage. So, for example, let's say the Inferno Dragon gives an extra 7% damage, okay? Now, assuming a team got the first dragon, let's say that whatever the main attack damage carry is, let's say Zhao or something, okay? They have 100 AD, and now they get the 7% buff. What does that mean? Now they have 107 AD. That is a small amount in the grand scheme of things this early. There's so many other factors that are going to be more important than that 7 AD, which is barely anything. Some of those things are just basic positioning, landing your abilities, and picking good fights. Since like having the numbers advantage, picking on good fights matters more than 7 AD. Now, let's say this game goes on and it reaches the late game. Now the ADC is full build, Xayah has all their items and everything, and they have 600 AD. Now 7% of that is almost 50 AD added on. That is a lot of attack damage. Plus, by that stage of the game, everyone's going to be grouped together. So now everybody on that team, in the 5v5, everybody on the enemy team will have that buff. And that's pretty insane and hard to beat off. Now, the point that I'm trying to get across to y'all is that because dragons are percentage buffs, and you don't have many stats early on just because all the numbers are low, they're not going to be that impactful early on. In the early game, mid game, they won't do too much, but they will scale very well into the late game. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize. This means that just because you lose that first drag or two, it doesn't mean the game is over. Those drag buffs, they don't make a huge impact until the very late game team fights. What I want to emphasize is that getting team wiped for one drag is not worth it. And that gold and positioning advantage, the entire map control you give up, the turrets you give up, that the enemy will get if you get team wiped and going for one drag, that's going to be way more impactful throughout majority of the match until it gets to super very late game. And honestly, that very rarely happens nowadays. Like most matches are ended early, and it's these gold leads that will get you more items and help you snowball. So if you don't have your main ult up, or if you don't have the numbers advantage for that drag fight, just give it up. It is not a huge deal. It is not the end of the world. And so many people do not realize that, honestly. And it's such a pain to deal with. But consider things like, what is the enemy comp good at, and what abilities do they have when debating to go for these fights or not? So I'll give you all an example just because examples help understand things. Fizz. Fizz is an insane one-burst champ, okay? First of all, people don't realize how busted Fizz is. And if you get ulted by Fizz, somebody will most likely die, whoever gets hit by that, just because Fizz will literally one-burst you. So if you walk up to try and contest a Fizz when they have the positioning advantage in his entire team, you'll likely get ulted and lose that fight. But if he uses that ult and he misses it, or he used it earlier, he's relatively weak. So then maybe you can get a good angle or an engage. Or if you don't want to contest even, that's also a fine choice because keep in mind, as the game scales on, you're going to be getting more tank and more stats. Plus your carries and squishies are going to be building items like stasis that's going to help counter the fizz burst. So you're going to have more survivability and not have to be as worried about that. Instead of trying to force it out that first drag, giving it over, getting team wiped, giving over so much gold, and just FFing at like 6 minutes. Another example, big AoE abilities that are super strong in team fights. Wukong, Katarina, Malphite, Ziggs all have monster ultimates that you should look for to fight if you have them on your team, and you should look to avoid if you're going up against them, and keep them in mind. And instead, you can try to play the map instead of trying to force it. And also, another thing to keep in mind is global ults, Galio, Twisted Fate, Pantheon. As one of the biggest advantages to playing those champs is that you can pressure the opposite side of the map. You can literally pressure the Baron lane, and then just choose to instantly join the fight if you want to do something there at the dragon. Now, I'm saying give up the Drake sometimes. Is it good to just give up the Drake? No, it's definitely not, because Drake's buffs are something. I'm not saying they're useless, but I'm saying there are other things that can be more valuable than that. And if you get nothing in return for giving up a Drake, that is a big loss. Instead, what can you do? You can look for a cross-map play. Now, what's a cross-map play? A cross-map play is pretty much when you know where the enemies or the enemy jungler is, and because you know their location and what they're looking for, you can look for a play on the opposite side of the map, whether that be a jungle invade, turret dive, or just taking a turret. And I talk about this a lot, but one of the biggest pressures about debating to go for a dive or an invade is that you can get rotated on, but whoever it is, whether it's a jungler, a mid laner, or side laner. However, when you know where the enemies are, if you know they're going to go for that drag, that takes away the pressure because you know exactly where they are. And if you can plan ahead of time, whether you want to contest the drag or not, that's going to allow you to set up for plays on the other side of the map if you decide that you don't want to fight at that drag. And a good example of what you can do when that enemy is on the first drag is looking for a dive on the Baron lane, or going for the Herald with the latest change, or looking for the first turret. There's actually often a small dead period after the first dragon, after that's taken, where all the turrets are still up. And I think this is a mistake a lot of junglers make, is they don't look for that first turret. Since the team that takes that first turret, they get 1,000 gold as a team, plus whatever you get gold from taking the turret plates. So that's important to look for. Now, I want to go into the topic of diving and ganks for a minute while we're talking about cross-map plays. When going for these plays with teammates, it's crucial to know what your teammate has available. For example, if you're diving with Akali in the Baron lane, let's say that the enemy team is on the dragon and you decide to make a cross-map play and look for the top turret on the Baron lane and look for a dive, and you have an Akali. You need to know whether or not they have their abilities up, such as their ultimate, their flash, along those lines, because that can be a game changer, especially for ult-reliant champs. Like if you're playing like ganking for a Garen or a Akali, those ultimates are huge. They're huge executes that can pretty much guarantee you'll kill when you go for a dive. But if they don't have those ults and you don't check it, that can really screw you over. So what you need to be doing is you need to be checking the scoreboard before you go for these big plays and seeing if your teammates has those summoner spells, has their ult off cooldown. And you can see if they have the ult off cooldown by looking at their picture on the scoreboard. And there's going to be a green circle in the corner of their picture. And when it's completely filled, that means they have their ult off cooldown. And when it's only partially filled, you can see how far their cooldown is. And if you didn't know that, you could just look at the leaderboards and just look around for the green circle and you'll know what I'm talking about. And this is vital when ganking. Let's say you're going to be ganking for a Malphite and you're ganking a Garen, okay? So it's you and a Malphite. You pop out as a Zhao. You start the engage, but then the Malphite does nothing as the Garen is running away. Why is this? This might be because the Malphite has nothing to follow up with. A mistake on your part, not the Malphite's fault, just because he had nothing up, and you should have realized that and not expected a follow-up because he can't get onto him. Because, for example, a Malphite, their ult is down, their flash is down. What are they going to do to a Garen that's running away? They could literally do nothing. They could use the first ability and that's about it. On the other hand, sometimes you're ganking for champs that have very good follow-ups, and these make for very solid ganks. Just keep that in mind. An example being Ahri with their charm, or Camille at level 5 with their ultimate. You need to wait for them to, for example, get that charm off cooldown, and then look for the play. And another thing that this opens the door for is chaining CC, crowd control. Pretty much perma-locking up the enemy. Slows, stuns, knockups. These don't stack, So it's vital to stagger these abilities, and something that a lot of junglers do need to work on. So for example, you're ganking for the Ahri, you let the Ahri charm land, and then as soon as the charm runs out, you're playing Vi, for example, then you use your first ability to knock him up right after. You do not knock him up while they're in the middle of the charm, as that's really, really ineffective, and you're wasting valuable seconds off crowd control, and that can really screw over ganks. Another example is with Blue Smite. If you're already slowing them from something, wait till the slow runs out before you Blue Smite so you get the full value of it, instead of slowing on top of a slow so then one of the slow gets cancelled and you waste all those valuable seconds. And another important and often overlooked factor to consider when pushing turrets and looking for dives are Minion Waves. Minion Waves help with a couple of things. It allows you to make better engages, and it also damages the enemy because whenever you attack an enemy champ, all the minion aggro changes towards you. So without Minion Waves, you're likely to take 2 or maybe even 3 turret shots just trying to get onto the enemy. On the other hand, with a Minion Wave, you can safely get close to the enemy without taking turret aggro. Plus, those minions will help you deal damage. Let me give you an example because, again, examples make things easier to understand. So now let's say I'm ganking the Baron lane, and we're looking to dive a Renekton. We have no minions, and I dive this Renekton. I take 1 or 2 turret shots trying to reach up to him, he stuns me, and then he ults, so he gets the bonus health and everything, and he dashes away with his dashes. So then I end up dying. I can't do anything there. On the other hand now, let's say we have a big minion wave crashing underneath the turret instead. What you could do is let the minions take the turret shots while you get up to the Renekton, and then, you don't even have to start the engagement. You have to consider what the enemy champ has. You can wait for the Renekton to use his stun or dash first, because as you get closer to him, he's likely going to start to panic and use that stun thinking you're going to engage and everything. But the thing is that you haven't even attacked him yet. So the minions are still soaking in those turret shots, and stunning you underneath the turret, it's pointless because you aren't even taking to those turret shots. Now you can engage without worry of getting stunned underneath turret, and your Baron laner can follow up. The same applies for other champs, like when you're diving a Fiora. They're going to have their counter ability, so if you can try and bait that out first when looking for the dive, that can be huge. And another thing about minions to consider is whether it'll be a normal minion wave or a cannon minion wave with empowered minions. And that's something to look at when deciding whether you want to push a turret or not, because one normal minion wave, that's going to die pretty quickly, but with a cannon minion wave, that's going to last so much longer. Before I get into some even more complex topics, I'm just going to throw out some random general tips that I think are pretty cool, and you might not use these every game, but when you do use these, I honestly think they can come in clutch and be complete game changers. And the first thing I want to talk about is smiting monsters for health. As you know, when you smite a monster camp, it gives you health back, and especially in the early game phase, this is a whole lot of health. And a cool trick that you could do is if you're fighting somebody early, like let's say level 3, level 4, and both of y'all are getting really low, a very smart move you could do is to smite a nearby camp instead for that bonus health. And this can be huge, especially for those times when junglers are trading, and it comes down to one of those moments where both of y'all are like 1/4 health, and it's almost a coin flip as to who's going to win the rest of that. And using a smite on a monster nearby, getting you that bonus health, is going to be so much more impactful than even if you can't smite the enemy, that's not going to do as much, just because the health you get from a smite early on gives you so much. Okay, now the next random tip I wanted to talk about is buying teleport. Now let's say you're 20 minutes in a match, most of the turrets are down, and you're dead, you're about to respawn, so it's a 5v4 on the map right now, and the enemy's at Baron, okay? The Baron's at about 4,000 health, let's just say. And whoever wins this fight is almost for sure going to win the game, just because it's so late, and it's pretty much the game-deciding fight with the Baron. Now you respawn, you try and run there in time to make it a 5v5 again, but by the time you get there, the Baron is gone, your team had died trying to fight for it. Instead, what you could have done is sold your boots and bought TP and teleported over, making it a 5v5 and giving you a chance at a steal. And this can be huge in the late game at these game-deciding fights, where you can't afford to spend 20 to 30 seconds running over after you respawn, just because the fight is starting already, and without you there, by the time you get there, your ADC has gotten bursted out, your mid mispositioned and died, and everybody entered. Now, of course, don't do this for random fights, just because you do lose a little bit of gold by selling your boots and buying teleport, but this can be a game changer and really catch enemies off guard in the late game, Since a lot of times if they might see you're down, the enemy jungler is down, they might try and force an Elder Dragon or a Baron. And then they're going to be like, okay, this guy's about to respawn, but he has to run all the way back. Well, boom, you just buy teleport over. It's a 5v5. Now it's completely even. And yeah, that's just something I want to mention that has really won me so many games, actually. You guys would be surprised, but this comes in clutch in the late game. And another fun fact, if you're not aware, this is just another really random fact, is that the river scuttle actually runs away from you. The movements for the scuttle might seem random, but if you pay attention to it, you'll notice whatever direction you're approaching it from, it will always move away from you. So you can actually use this to help you move the scuttle to whatever direction you want, whether it be closer to a lane that you want to gank next, or closer to a camp that you want to farm, or away from a champ that might be trying to contest the scuttle. Now, the next thing I want to mention is gap closing. And this is a huge topic, especially for junglers. I think it's most important, because you're the ones that are going to be ganking, and it's vital for you to be staying on top of these enemy champs. And especially on assassins, bruisers, you need to be staying on these squishy ADCs, mid laners. And this is especially important because when you're ganking, most people will have their flash up, and you need to plan what to do if they do flash away. If you watch my videos, you see I emphasize this a lot, and it's helped me secure so many kills. And in fact, most of these tips you can find in action in my videos if y'all are interested. But let's say I'm playing a Wukong, going to gank a Twisted Fate who still has flash up, okay? How do I play this out? I'm a Wukong, okay? My third ability is the dash gap closing ability. Do I engage with that? No, I do not. Because let's say I engage with that third ability there, and then the Twisted Fate flashes away. What can I do then? I just use my gap closer and my dash. I have no way of getting onto him. That is not the play. I literally can't get back onto him. Instead, what I have to do is I have to run up to them, use my Empowered First ability with the extra range and everything, and then force out the Twisted Fate flash, and after they flash, then I use my third ability to gap close, and I'm still right on top of them. And then I could always use my second ability, clone, when they pull out the gold card or something. But now we'll get into some of the super deep stuff. What I'm going to be talking about from here on out revolves around two things, and those two things are lane priority and enemy jungle tracking. As a jungler, you probably have the largest power out of everybody in the game to start small skirmishes in the early games, and starting the right ones can easily lead to snowballs, since this game is very snowbally, honestly, and most of them end kind of early. First of all, I want to talk about what is lane priority. Lane priority is pretty much in a lane matchup. If a fight were to break out somewhere else, such as on the river, which laner will be able to rotate first. And that's often dictated by the position of the minion wave. I'm telling you, minion wave positioning is so key to pay attention to as a jungler, as it'll tell you where the enemies are going to be positioned, who's likely going to be able to rotate first, and whether it's going to make a good gank or not, for example. And imagine if you're going to be laning versus somebody, and you have the minion wave shoved underneath their turret, and you have them pushed back underneath their turret. And then a fight breaks out on the river. Who's going to be able to rotate first? Who's going to be able to get to that fight first? Of course, it's going to be you, because you have them shoved underneath turret, and you can rotate first. On the other hand, if you're the one that's pushed back to your turret, you're farming underneath your turret, the enemy has the positioning advantage. Dang, I can't talk now. I've been talking for a while. And the enemy will get there first. Now, oftentimes, if you're shoved underneath your turret, you don't have the priority, and you still try to rotate, what will happen is you're just going to get cut off, and you're going to die trying, and you're going to lose a bunch of minions, because the wave is shoved underneath your turret. And this is vital to pay attention to as a jungler, since it often dictates where you want to take your fights and which ones you want to take. And this is another thing I want to talk about when farming up your camps. Another thing to notice along the map when you're panning the maps early on is paying attention to which lanes have the lane priority. And as a higher tier jungler, you definitely need to be looking at that. Which places you think are going to be good places to force fights where you're going to be able to get the rotates first. And the biggest part where this will come into effect is the spawn of the scuttles at 125. The most common jungle clear, it's going to be the red buff to the raptors, to the wolves, and then to the blue. That's the most common jungle clear, okay? And then they're going to head to that side scuttle, whichever side the blue buff was on. Now, let's say whatever side that scuttle is on that the enemy's going to go for, let's say that your mid laner and that side laner on that side of the scuttle, they both have the priority. They both have that wave shoved all the way in. Both the enemies are shoved underneath their turret. And now, what you could do is, for example, you can change your pathing So you arrive at that scuttle at the same time and fight the enemy for that scuttle. But since your laners have priority there, your laners, your mid lane and your side laner, they have the priority. They're going to be the ones to rotate first, and then boom, you have the 3v1. A lot of people think that jungle is a 1v1 role, but that's one of the biggest misconceptions, I think. Jungle is not a 1v1 role at all. It's going to be these teammates in these fights that are going to determine who's going to win most likely. Because it doesn't matter if you're a Lee Sin versus somebody that's strong in the late game, such as Rammus. If your teammates rotate first, if you get 2 other teammates to rotate in a 3v1, it's not going to make a difference at all. So that's just things to pay attention to, and adapting your pathing to fight in areas where you do have priority, and avoiding areas where your enemy laners have priority. And that's going to help you pick smart fights and snowball the enemy jungle. And that's the entire concept between double scuttling, if you've ever heard of that term. What that means is one jungler is able to secure both of the scuttles, and usually this happens just due to an error of the enemy jungle. What happens is the enemy jungle, they try to go for a scuttle, and that scuttle, they do not have the priority in that lane. So the enemy jungle, they go for a scuttle, but I have the priority in the lanes near me, and then I'm able to recognize that they're going for that scuttle, and I change my pathing to run into them. And just because I have the priority, I can spam ping my teammates, and I'm going to get the rotate first, win the fight, and get the scuttle. And then I could just head over to the second scuttle. And overall, early game rotations, they're a super complex topic, and they change match to match. So honestly, I can't just tell you all in this video, do this and do that, just because, again, it changes based off how the match is going. But if you've watched my past 2 to 3 videos, you see that I play towards my lanes that have priority so much, and I pay attention to that so much when I'm farming up my camps in the very early game, and I force fights around those areas. And just because of that, I'm able to snowball so many games. And also, a good time to analyze your lanes and to determine which ones will have priority when farming your camps is when you are farming in the early game. Scanning the lanes and planning out what you want to do. Planning in the jungle is key. One of the worst things you could do in jungle is waste time. Instead, you need to already know what your next move is, what your goals are, and what you want to do next. And this adds on to other things that you want to be paying attention to when scanning lanes in the very early game. I know I didn't add on priority when I mentioned this in the lower tier sections because it's really a higher tier concept. But paying attention to priority, abilities, summoner spells, along those lines, hero trait, champ traits, I mean. But this whole concept of priority, it goes beyond just scuttle fights and just basic stuff. It can be used for invades, deciding whether you want to play for an objective or not. So for instance, let's say that your Baron laner is getting hard destroyed, okay? And that seems to be a common theme I noticed, but fighting at the Herald might not be the best move. If your Baron laner, it's super far behind, they're always getting killed and they're always shoved behind. Because if you take that fight, then that's the weak side of the map now, because you're losing that lane hard. And if you go for fight over there and both the Baron laners rotate, there's a good chance you're going to lose just because you have a weak laner. Instead, what you could do is you can look to play towards the other side of the map, look for a cross-map play, look for an invade on the dragon side of the map, and look for a dive on the dragon lane while the enemy is doing Herald, instead of trying to contest that Herald again, trying to force that objective when you shouldn't even be taking that fight, and throwing away a lot of gold if you die and get team wiped. And this last concept that I'm going to talk about is probably the hardest to master, and I work on it in my videos a lot, and I'm still working on it too, and it's jungle tracking. Jungle tracking is pretty much trying to find out what rotations the enemy jungler is doing, and what their next movements are going to be. Successfully jungle tracking can really open the door up to 2 main things: counterganking and crossmap plays, which I've touched upon a little bit so far. Now, when you go for a countergank versus a crossmap play, a countergank means that you successfully predict where the enemy jungler is going to gank, and you match it. You also go for a gank after they go for the gank, and try and win that. And when would you do this? You would do this in a case where you believe you can win the 2v2 or 3v3. And then you go for a cross-map play when you believe you wouldn't win the fight anyways, even if you do go for a counter gank. And there's this saying in League of Legends, it's not really in mobile MOBAs yet, but never gank a losing lane. And that's just because jungle tracking, people don't do it in mobile MOBAs. And it really is a really big concept that people need to work on. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the junglers, they just aren't as good as like PC junglers, just because And PC, these concepts are used a lot, but they really haven't been implemented into mobile MOBAs yet. And never gank a losing lane. And one of the reasons why this saying is a thing is that if you get counter-ganked in a losing lane, then you don't win that fight, and you waste so much time there being unproductive, because the enemy will have full advantage because of that counter-gank, and they can do as they please because your laner is losing compared to their laner, and you wouldn't win the 2v2 if your laner's losing, most likely. And pretty much what this means is you waste your time. You literally just have to sit behind, and you play on the enemy's pace, which is key in jungling. You want to be playing at your own pace, setting the tempo yourself, instead of being the reactive one that's playing from the back foot the entire time. And if you want some tips to track the enemy jungler, the best way to do so is through buffs and the buff timers. A good way to see what buffs a jungler has is by, first of all, looking at which enemy laners are giving a leash at level 1, because often those laners are going to be missing for the first few seconds, so you can already figure out which buff they started at. And then from that point, an enemy jungler will have two options usually. They're going to either clear that one side of the jungle, or they're going to play for both buffs. And then if you can figure that out from there, you can easily predict which scuttle they're going to end up at. And then this is where you combine this with the topic of lane priorities. If you can track their jungle pathing, if you get visions of their buff, see what kind of clear they're doing, you can figure out which scuttle they're going to play for, and then look at your side lanes, determine whether they have priority or not, and whether or not you want to change your pathing to contest it or not. Another way to see what buffs a jungler has is to just look beneath their champ. You can see if they have the red buff or blue buff underneath them, and that can help you to know what clear they have done or what they've taken so far. Now, you need to put yourself in the enemy jungler's shoes when trying to jungle track, and trying to predict what they're going to go for. I actually have a jungle tracking and counter ganking video that show both of these concepts pretty well in my opinion, and if you know which buff they are on, then you know what lanes they can gank, because let's say you're on the red buff, there's only two lanes you can gank, the side lane next to it or the mid lane. So what that means is that the opposite side lane on the other side of the map, you can set up for a dive there if you want to go for the cross-map play, or you can set up for a counter gank on the same side. Now let's say that the side laner that's next to that red buff, they're pretty overextended. Well, put yourself in the enemy's shoes. What's likely going to happen? They're going to clear that buff and then go for that gank. So that also opens the door for counter ganking if you do want to go for the counter gank instead. And looking at the lane states and seeing if anybody on your team is low or if any of your teammates are overextended, that can easily help you determine if they're going to look for a gank or not, and then you can try and warn your teammates ahead. And a useful tip to track the enemy jungle is, as I said, using the buff respawn timer to help determine where your enemies will be. So I just want to go through an example together. I'm going to go through the basic jungle clear that a lot of junglers do, and it's the standard clear. It's the red to raptors to wolves, and then to the blue buff, and then into that side river scuttle. So after they take that river scuttle, what options would an enemy jungle have? They can look for a gank in mid or the side lane that's next to them if there's a good opening. If there isn't a good opening, then what do they have? They can either try and invade your Krugs, or they can try and go back and farm their Gromp. And if they do these last two farming ones, then they won't appear on your map. So if they don't appear on your map after they take that scuttle, then you know that they're probably just going to be farming one of those two. And you know that that's what they're going to be doing. So after they clear, if they still don't see a good gank after they take those camps, one of them, then they're going to just reset now. And a good way to know where the enemy jungle is again, put yourself in their shoes. They just cleared their entire blue side jungle, right? They cleared their wolves and bluff and blue buff, and then they cleared the scuttle, and then they got their Gromp, let's say. Now their entire blue side is down. They would not go back to their blue side just because there's no more of that jungle up. Instead, they're most likely going to go to their red side as long as there's no really good ganks or anywhere else on the map. They're going to go to the red side because that's what's respawning now. So you know they're going to be on that side of the map. Now you know which lanes are a threat of getting ganked. That mid lane still, plus that side lane that's next to their red buff. So that's just a basic tip on example of how you can track the enemy jungle. And it's pretty much just a Mac hack, but it's in your head. And a useful tip is to use your own buff respawn timers to figure out theirs. Because for example, if both of y'all start at the red buff at the same time, then that means that both of y'all's red buff will respawn at the same time. And you can kind of use that to help mirror and try and get to know the timers for your enemy, even if you don't have vision of their jungle. And another example is anticipation, predicting where the enemy will go. Let's just say you lose track of the enemy jungler and you have to reset. And now the only thing that you have up in your jungle is your Gromp on one side and your Krugs on the other side. Well, which lane do you go to? Go to the side where you think your laner is overextended and that the enemy jungle might gank. So let's say your top laner, where your Gromp is super far ahead, okay? They're playing super aggro compared to on the other side where your Krugs are. Your laner's playing super safe. It's a full health Garen underneath turret. There's no way that's going to get ganked. So by going up to that Gromp on the top side where your laner is overextended, if the enemy jungler goes for a gank, you're in a very good position to react. You can easily make a play from there and easily go for a counter gank. Now, overall, it's a very complicated topic that requires a lot of practice to master, and you can't really just flat out explain it in one video. But if you can learn it, you can easily be one of the best junglers out there. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Sorry for the length. I realized it was kind of long, but I hope you all enjoyed. And again, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't, and comment down below, and I'll see you all in the next video.